everybody, thanks for joining me for another one-man review. This one's going to be kind of different. I'm going to be looking at the complete works that I have, at least, that are available in English of the artist SHUZO Oshimi, and ranking them in the order from my least favorite to my favorite. You can see I have a gigantic stack of books here. I first became a fan of SHUZO Oshimi with this book, Blood on the Tracks. This first volume of it really sold me on his work, and over the last couple years I've gone and got everything of his that I can that's translated, and I've been thinking for a long time about how I want to do a video. Do I want to cover each one of them separately? Do I want to do a big artist overview? And they're all just so good, they're all so complex, and I have too much to say about each one of them. So I thought the best thing I could do is do a video where I rank them, even though most of them are things that I think are very, very good books. It's hard to put them in an order. But I figured I'd do a ranking video and give you like the bare bones plot of each one and show some of the images or bits of dialogue or sequences that I like in each one. So it's still probably going to be kind of a long video, but I think this is the shortest way I can approach the entirety of his work and cover the themes that SHUZO Oshimi deals with as well. His themes are pretty consistent throughout, and that does, after you've read a bunch of them, made some of his work a little repetitive, and I think that's part of how mentally I'm ranking them, is the ones that cover the themes with more oomph and the ones that seem repetitive of other things. But it's very obvious to me reading his work that he suffered abuse both from probably his mother, as well as probably a female classmate or someone he dated. That theme of abuse by women in his life shows up pretty much in every work, and in both of those formats, where it seems like the mother figure was an abusive figure, and also someone that he dated or a classmate or something like that. So you'll see that show up over and over, and I think that's what lends his work a lot of weight to me, is even though most of his work starts out with some particular manga genre, and it seems just like a perverse version of those genres. Usually by the end of the work, a very common thing is a time jump, and so you'll see characters dealing with the trauma much later in life, and very, very often, almost every time, he comes to some kind of conclusion in a very satisfying way that both lets the characters move on from their trauma and live a better life, and oftentimes will end with a peek at the situation from the abuser's side of things. Especially in his most potent works, he'll kind of show what they were struggling with, that led them to be abusive. So his work, I think, is very empathetic, even though, like, on the surface level, especially when you jump in, they're very almost like perverse and abusive to the reader as well. There's something about the way that he twists and turns, and even though you get used to his standard twists and turns, there's still something about it that leaves the stories redemptive in the end. And I think that's the thing that really draws me to his work, is that he's really trying to explore everyone's motivation, and nothing's simple, nothing's written off as like they're the good guy, they're the bad guy. That it feels very informed by real life, and especially informed by what must be a pretty intense childhood, at least of his, is his experience, if not carrying into his adulthood as well, and that comes through in the work. I also think he's doing some of the most tense and horrific manga out there, which you'll see. So we'll go ahead and just jump in and take a look at the books. I'm very curious for other people who've read all of these works or read most of his works, where these works rank in yours, so comment below and let me know. But this is going to be a long enough video, so let's just jump in. First up, lowest on my list, probably my least favorite of Oshimi's work, is Avant-Garde Yumiko. Avant-Garde Yumiko is a one-shot volume. It was originally made and published in Japan in 2003, and it definitely sets most of his themes, the kind of abuse by a classmate themes that run through a lot of his work. This is about a girl, Yumiko. She is very obsessed with penises, wanting to see one in real life. you can see in this opening sequence is kind of seeing them everywhere, seeing them in everything. So eventually what she does is she gets a boy named Shoichi to pose for her. It's a classmate, and she basically bullies him into being her live figure model. She goes through a number of options and figures that doing live. So first up, and obviously my least favorite of Shuzo Oshimi's work, is Avant-Garde Yumiko. Avant-Garde Yumiko was an early work of his. This came out first in 2003. It's a one-volume, one-and-done story, but it does set up a lot of his themes. And I think, like, if you haven't read any of his other work, this one's probably still interesting. This is definitely in his line of abuse by classmates. It's also, I think, fitting in a specific genre in manga that I'm not super familiar with, but like the young girl who hasn't got laid yet and is interested in. I know I've seen a number of books kind of advertised like that. So what it is this young girl, Yumiko, is very interested in just seeing a penis, and throughout the entirety of the book she's insisting that there's no sexual interest in it. It's just that she's interested in dicks and wants to see a dick, just seeing them everywhere. She does a lot of like research looking at phallic ceremonies in Japan, trying to see pictures and books and things like that, but eventually comes to the conclusion that the best way to see penises would be to see them live. And so she goes into an art classroom hoping to do some figure drawing, and meets a boy, Shoichi, who she then bullies into. And this is where it's a common theme in Oshimi's work. You have school kids, a male school kid being bullied by a female into doing things he doesn't want, usually sexual things. So she bullies him into posing for her, and she thinks this is her best shot at seeing a dick in real life. So you could see that she's here forcing Shoichi to pose for her, and then this this is what she's been drawing the whole time. And the abuses get worse. The things that she puts him through get more and more embarrassing for him. Here you can see that she's basically been painting his member a la Yves Klein and then stamping it onto papers. She just has this kind of a obsessive relationship with Shoichi's dick. And throughout the book, kind of insisting that there's nothing sexual behind it. But then at the end of the book, she comes to the realization and that she just needs to get laid, and like that will cure her problem. So then in the end you have this scene where they have sex together, and that cures her problem. This is probably what makes this my least favorite Oshimi book, is that normally, well, I'll say that in this one, it feels like he was giving himself a pass throughout the majority of the book, saying this isn't sexual, this is just exploring something else. And then at the end of the book, it obviously becomes sexual. So he's going against even his own kind of stated reasoning for making the book, that this character was not sexualizing in the end that she is. But throughout, really good art. I mean, there's some really great, you can see like the distortions in the face here and stuff that make it still a comedic situation, but also you can see here that Shoichi's still fairly traumatized by the situation where he's being attacked by this crazy girl in class. So definitely an early one, definitely setting up the themes. But I think in terms of like flipping the story on its head and coming to a good resolution for the characters, this one is pretty weak. Another thing that I want to make sure that we get to is that Sean has a new book coming out from Living the Line called Her Frankenstein. And when I first got to read the PDF proof of that, I thought, oh wow, this is very similar in theme and tone to Shuzo Oshimi's work. And so anyone who's a fan of Shuzo Oshimi's work, that thematically, I think you will really enjoy this historical manga that came out way, way, way earlier than Oshimi's work. I think I don't know the date on it. I haven't been involved in that project really, other than reading it. But the late '60s, early '70s, I think, on Her Frankenstein. And so seeing someone deal with the similar themes and stuff in an earlier context, but with as much intensity as the Shuzo Oshimi work, was really, really interesting to me. So I'm going to go ahead and play a preview now of Her Frankenstein. And if you are a fan of Shuzo Oshimi's work, I really suggest that you check it out. Thanks for watching, everyone, and enjoy the preview of Her Frankenstein.
Back to the land, let's get away, just for one day. Let me see you stripped down to the bone. Let me see you stripped down to the bone.
Next up, and probably made very closely after Avant-Garde Yumiko, is Sweet Poolside. This one, again, is a one-volume one and deals with pretty much the exact same themes of a female classmate taking advantage of a male classmate in some situation. This one, though, the situation's a little more interesting to me, and that levels it up. You can see Oshimi growing as a writer, basically, in this one. So the main characters in this, we have Ayako Goto and Toshihiko Oda. I'm just going to call them Goto and Oda. So Oda is someone who's made fun of for being like squeaky clean. He's like so hairless that everyone makes fun of him for his like hairless rubbery body. And then on the flip side, Goto is a girl who has very hairy arms, very hairy legs, armpits, and everything. And she's very embarrassed by it. But Oda is fascinated by her hair. He's just absolutely jealous of her and finds it attractive, almost, and sexy, because it's what he's lacking. Likewise, she, kind of notices and is envious of his skin. I forget exactly why, but for some reason, in his obsession with hair, he's become expert at shaving hair, and so she basically abuses him and puts him in this situation where now he's her designated shaver. Obviously, he's in these situations where he can see up her skirt, and he's thinking about shaving other parts of her. There's sexual tension all the way throughout, but she's fairly popular once she gets no hair on her and is dating a lot of people, and so it's kind of just using him in that sense. And that drives most of the story, is their relationship where, he's not getting what he wants out of it, and she's getting what she wants, and she has her little slave boy like shaving her legs. So a more interesting situation. I think the ending in this one's a little better. One thing that I do like that shows up in this one, that shows up in a lot of Oshimi's work, is he'll do afterwards. And in the afterwards, he gets really, really personal in a way that is strangely, it adds to the stories in a strange way. Oftentimes, I find that when authors comment on their work afterwards, they over-explain or they ruin it a bit. But with Oshimi's work, the stories themselves are so intense that as a reader, you're kind of left wondering, like, what happened to this dude? Like, who did this to this guy? And he kind of covers these things. He covers his deepest, darkest thoughts and some very strange thoughts that he's had in some of them. And so I find them really nice compliments. In this one, he's presenting himself like, oh, hi, I'm Oshimi. Here, I'm the schoolgirl. I'm projecting my desire to be a girl. So there is definitely an interest in a number of his works. And I don't know if he's interested in being a woman in the sense of being transsexual, like getting the transformation, undergoing the chemicals, or dressing like a woman or anything. But he's very, very fascinated. I think he's so scared of women that he wants to understand their experience from their side. And in some of the works, he's trying to use that, it seems like, to justify his own perversions. We'll talk about that with Inside Marie. But always in the end, like I said, he kind of gives himself exactly the right pass in a lot of the works. I don't think it works so well in these first couple ones, but he's trying to figure out the formula. So I think this is an interesting part of his books, and it's this confessional nature of it. I don't know, because the works can make you feel so gross, it's kind of nice to have the author jump in afterwards and explain where it's coming from. So that starts, as far as I can tell, in Sweet Poolside. Next up, and this could definitely change for me, is the series Welcome Back, Alice. This series is currently still coming out, so I don't know where it goes and how it ends. That may be one of the reasons that this is so low on the list. I may have a higher opinion of this when I see the series complete. But after reading a lot of his other work and knowing that this is more recent, it just feels like he's dipping back into old themes, dipping back into the old formulas a little bit too much. And it's just, at least so far, not got as many memorable scenes and memorable writing, memorable bits of art to me. This book definitely seems to be in the boys' love genre with a trans twist to it. This is another one where he's most definitely exploring his interest in trans issues, or at least gender swap issues. There are three characters. That's a pretty common thing in his work as well, like a love triangle between a young boy and two girls, one being more abusive and one being more sweet, and like the definitely the better choice is someone to get involved in, oftentimes having the boy make the wrong choice. So you have Yohi is the boy here, and you have Yui Mitani is the girl. This is them as young kids. Obviously, Yohi has a crush on Mitani, and then there's a third character to complete the triangle, which is K. K is Yohi's friend, young boy that he's friends with, and K teaches him very early on. He's like, they're talking about masturbation basically, and K gives him insights on how to do this better. So in their youth, they kind of form this semi-sexual relationship. Also, there's a betrayal in their youth where K makes out with Yui, and Yo sees that, and then the kind of like look that is given between them, the glance that is exchanged, there's like this coolness. And this look is something that Oshimi has really perfected, but I think in other works of his, it's a little more potent. And again, I've seen it a lot in his work. So by the time you get to Welcome Back, Alice, it just seems a little more predictable. But there's something very chilling in the way that character looks at him. Something where there's a bit of pity, but a bit of a challenge, or a bit of like this character's feeling a bit of betrayal as well, maybe. So that's one of the things I really, really love about Oshimi's art, is he'll have these expressions that almost look like blank expressions, but he always gets them to communicate so much, at least to me. I always feel like a really complexity of emotions going on. The twist in this book, or the real setup for the story, is that we take a jump then from grade school to high school, and all three characters now happen to be back in the same school, and Kay has shown back up now as dressing and presenting as a girl, and you can see here is kind of inciting a sexual encounter again, saying, I'll remember how I taught you about masturbation? I'll teach you some stuff way more intense than masturbation. And obviously suggesting oral sex, sticking the tongue out. And so that's pretty much the setup for Welcome Back Alice, is the love triangle between the three of them. Kei definitely plays the role of the abusive kid in this one, and Yui Mitani plays the role of like the sweet girl that Yo should go with, but is kind of drawn in by this darker character. There's abuses in here as well, where Kei is kind of like setting up for Yo and Yui to date, but is manipulating both of them, and then will interfere and is messing with Yo the whole time as well, trying to seduce him. So forcing this choice and making everyone's life uncomfortable is the core of this book. And that plays out with less twists and turns, at least so far. There's 5 volumes of this so far. Plays out with less twists and turns than the other ones, and just because of the repetition, I think makes this a little less interesting. I think something that's worth noting is that in volume 5, the theme of posing for an artist shows back up. So here, Kei is starting to develop some kind of relationship with a 4th character, a tall, awkward girl who doesn't really feel like she fits in her body, who's an artist. And Kei offers to pose. This girl has been coming up and saying, "Oh, you're so beautiful. Can I draw you?" And Kei's resistant to that, but then finally gives in and says, "You want to paint me in the nude, right?" And they have a scene here where Kei strips down, and you can see that he's still a he, but is presenting as very effeminate and beautiful and androgynous. And so these characters start to have a relationship. But again, you can see Kei being manipulative, where it's like, well, if you're going to paint me, then you need to do so naked as well. And so always using his beauty and sexuality to suck other people in and manipulate them. And here you see he's got this girl who's tall and thin and a little androgynous herself, small boobs and everything, gets her to strip down and is having some kind of relationship. So that's at the end of volume 5. I don't know where this series goes exactly, but it could be, it could level up. It, as often happens for me with Oshimi's work, is the first 5-6 volumes, whatever, just set everything up, and they set up all the discomfort, and there's these parts where you're like, man, I shouldn't be reading this kind of thing, and then he always lands the ending. So this could change for me as the ending comes in. I don't know how long this series will go on, but as of right now, this is one of my least favorites, just because of the kind of, it seems like ground well trodden. Next up, and now we're getting into works that, like, from here on out, I think they're all really good in their own way. We have Shino Can't Say Her Name. This book was originally done in 2011 and 2012. Again, a one-off piece. This is probably the least formulaic for Oshimi's work, but it seems probably the most formulaic in general. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if this influenced another work that I've read, or if this is just a typical kind of story arc in manga, so other people can inform me maybe. But this book is obviously about Shino Oshimi. Shino can speak pretty fine generally, but has some stutter problems, and especially can't say her own name. The sh sound in her name, I believe, is what it is that she has problems saying, and so will stutter, especially if asked to say her name. But she can say it backwards, and so she feels like the outsider. Everyone's laughing at her, and kind of has this speech impediment problem. And there's this kid, especially. He's kind of making fun of her and abuses her, and that shows up later. Eventually, Shino meets Keo. Keo is like an outsider, kind of the more artsy musical chick, like the edgy one, and so kind of picks on her at first, but really just bullies her into, not really bullies her, but kind of pushes her, forces her into engaging with her and becoming friends with her. It's like, hey, if you can't talk to me, just write things down. So they do become good friends. When you go to Keo's room, I noticed some really interesting things on the wall. There's Flaming Lips, Bob Dylan, like everything's very American influenced. And then a poster for Ghost World, which I think is really, really interesting for the movie. And these characters do kind of have that like outsider interaction that the characters in Ghost World have. I'm curious because this exact poster shows up in another book. I didn't find it again and put a tag in it for this video, but there is a second Oshimi work that has this same Ghost World movie poster. And so I wonder how much of an influence that movie was on him, if he's read the actual Daniel Clowes comic or if he's only familiar with the property through a movie. But Ghost World shows up twice, and there are a lot of characters that kind of have those outsider friend interactions in his work. In this one, it's definitely between Keo and Shino. Keo uses music as a way to get Shino to open up, so they'll go out and perform on the street and find out that Shino actually has a really good singing voice and is more comfortable singing than speaking, kind of overcomes the speech impediment that way. This third character is a kid who had bullied Shino earlier on in the book and now is getting to know her and apologizing and thinking she's cool and wants to be involved in their band, even though he's not very musical. And so this reminds me a lot of, in a shorter form story, reminds me a lot of the other manga that I've read that has this kind of format of the bully getting to know the girl who can't talk in a silent voice. And that I really enjoyed that. I thought it was a complex like look at autism and disability and stuff, and people overcoming like a past of having a bully and getting to know each other and making up for one's past bullying. So that happens in this story, where this male character comes in and becomes very supportive of Shino, and then the three of them together become a band, and they break up and they go have a final concert at the end where Shino jumps in and helps sing, and it kind of wraps up really nice. So this definitely deals with the theme of bullying, but much, much lighter. It's much more about the characters coming together in the end and helping each other out and helping Shino become comfortable with herself. So this one's much kinder. There's nothing overly sexual in here. There's nothing overly abusive in here other than just kids making fun of each other for speech impediments. Not anywhere near the level of abuse in the other Oshimi works. So a good one. Interesting in that it's like out of character for him or a little off theme. And given that A Silent Voice came out in 2013 and this one came out in 2011, I kind of wonder if this had an influence on A Silent Voice, or if, and I think Silent Voice is much better than this, partially just because it's longer, so it can really delve into the topic more. But I wonder if this was an influence on that story, or if this is just a kind of common theme, a common genre in the, I don't know what to call it, but the school kid genre in Japan, that there's like the bully and then the bully becoming friends and lovers. I could see that becoming being a pretty standard story, but I gotta wonder if this had some influence on A Silent Voice, because they're both dealing with like a speech impediment and a bully. But a sweet little book, really well done, and yeah, it's just low on the list because other things are so good. Next up on the list, and I almost feel embarrassed that this isn't at the bottom, that it's higher up on the list, but I actually think that this work is one of the more surprising works in the sense of justifying itself through a redemptive story, because it leans so far into absurd, grotesque pornography that it's hard to recommend it. But I actually really enjoyed this, really guiltily enjoyed this book. This was started in 2005, so I think this was probably Oshimi's first long-form story. This is Devil Ecstasy, and I can't even show that much of it. It's a pretty sexually explicit and intense book, but it combines like the erotica with the horror and the idea of the bullying, and then it has the typical time jump and this like it's more of like an action adventure type of story in a lot of places as well, but it ends with the same redemptive arc for the characters that I think is really sweet. And given how vile of a book it is in general, how much sweetness is imbued in it is actually pretty interesting. There's also, for absurd as it is, there's just a lot of really amazing imagery, and you really see Oshimi's chops as a horror author. The main character in this is Noboru, and Noboru was abused by a older cousin of his as a child. So the abuse theme is a big part of this. It sets the core of the character. She had very large breasts and forced her young cousin Noboru, like forced him into a closet and then forced his face between her breasts. And so Noboru has this really deep-seated fear of women with large breasts and large breasts in general. Right out the gate, kind of both a sweet and sad, but also almost, comedic in this guy being squashed by these big breasts. It's a really weird mix-up of feelings that you have as a reader about this, where you kind of want to laugh, you kind of want to be scared, you kind of want to be repulsed that you're even reading the book, but then you feel like this definitely could be a real world situation, and you want to feel bad for the character. And that mix up of his work makes Oshimi so good to me. And there is an abusive quality where he's almost abusing you as a reader, because it's also well done. But at least me, I'm like, I shouldn't even be reading this. I feel guilty for that. And in the same way that his abusive characters kind of manipulate people to keep going on with their schemes, like he manipulates me into keep reading these things. And then after you've gone with it a couple times and you have that like nice ending, you go, okay, well, it's all right. Noboru is taken by a friend of his. They want to go lose their virginity, so they're going to go to this new brothel in town called Devil Ecstasy. And they've been hearing that the prostitutes there do a really, really good job, and everyone comes out very happy. As they go in there, of course, Noboru picks the prostitute with the smallest breasts, Malulu. She becomes a major character in the book. There's a lot of main characters in this book, but I'll stick in my explanation mostly with Noboru and Malulu, because they're the emotional core of the story. They're the sweet part of the story that gets their redemption after every awful thing that they go through. So they have this first encounter, and he basically tells her that she's got a complex about her small breasts, and he tells her that he thinks they're beautiful because that's the first time that he's ever seen breasts that didn't scare him. And so she kind of forms a bond with him. He's also her first customer that she's ever had, so they kind of form this trauma bond right out the gate. As this goes on, what you find out is that Devil Ecstasy is actually a brothel for succubi, and even Malulu herself is a succubi. So there's a lot of truly horrific but also absolutely hilarious images in here with these succubi prostitutes trying to attack people, and I just can't help but like crack up laughing at these scenes where he's got these women running, and you get that typical like jiggly boob thing that you get in the pornography manga, especially where they do the tone trick on the nipples to make it look like the boobs are jiggling. But here you've got these just absolutely terrifying women chasing after him, and the motion on the breasts has to crack me up. But also, man, like this proves to me like what a good artist Shuzo Oshimi is that he's taking, sexy chicks and making them absolutely terrifying. And comedic at the same time. It's just really strange mashup here in the story. So these succubi, what they do is they give such great blowjobs that they suck the man's soul out of his dick. This is called his same, SAEM, I think is how they're spelling it in the book. And in the Devil's Ecstasy, it's basically a big plot to take over the world and for the succubi to finally come out of the shadows and rule the world of men. Every man who has his soul sucked out of his dick basically shrivels and loses all of his powers and basically becomes desiccated and dies eventually. So there's a big police investigation going on. There's a lot of research being done on characters. There's other characters involved that are fighting the succubi. It's a pretty complex plot. I just don't want to dive into it too much because it's going to be a long video, and there's also, it's difficult to show a lot of the imagery in this book. But you see, again, Oshimi's power as a horror artist to make these absolutely terrifying images. Junji Ito's great and all, but I actually find Oshimi's work to be even more unsettling. I think because he's so unsettled himself in life. And you can see here, this is one of the succubi transformed into her real form and then killed. And this sucked out nasty body, just absolutely disgusting looking. This is a 2-volume one. I'm not even going to show volume 2, but at the end of the first volume, you get introduced to like the queen succubi, and again, you can see how horrific he's making what should be a sexy woman. She's this bald gal with big boobs. Spoiler alert, she winds up actually being the cousin that abused Noboru in his youth, and now she's leading this charge of the succubi. They're going to start expanding Devil's Ecstasy and having other locations. And then basically the whole second volume is the battle against this spread of the succubi. There's a completely ridiculous scene between the succubi and the police that are invading the brothel. And then there's an even more ridiculous scene where the succubi have been let loose onto the masses to kill all the men. There are some even more horrific scenes of how the succubi give birth, where they spit these ugly these babies with these nasty little noses like that. They vomit them out of their mouths, and that's how they get pregnant, is by sucking the souls of these men. So it's really absurd, really vile. Like I said, I have a hard time recommending it because a lot of the content's just so grotesquely over the top. But he does such a good job with Noboru and Malulu's relationship, making them so sweet and such sympathetic characters, dealing with the topic of abuse, and then giving them a really sweet, happy ending as well, that I actually wound up really liking this book, and I'll stand by it as, like, it's a well-done manga. The majority of the content of it is something that I don't really feel comfortable having around the house, but I do think it's a good work, and this is where I think he really comes into fruition as an artist. You can see he's able to cut loose on the more dramatics, the horrific imagery. He's playing more with style, and given the long form, he can delve into the complexity of the characters' issues and has more time to work out that kind of surprise happy ending. So I do like this one. It's just the content in it is so hard to stomach in some places. It has to leave it lower on the list, but I still think it's a good book. Now we're starting to get into the more well-known Shuzo Oshimi books. These are all longer series, 9-10 volumes a piece at least. So I'm gonna have to show a lot. I'm gonna do pretty thorough evaluations of them, so there will be spoilers in here, but his works take so many twists and turns that I'm definitely not covering it all. I'm just trying to give a general sense across the span of the series, the tone of it, what it's about, those kind of things. Happiness is a vampire story. You get that pretty much right out the gate, where Makoto Okazaki is attacked by a vampire named Nora, and he's turned. He is the character, the young school kid character that's basically now in this abusive relationship with this female vampire, and has crushes on girls at schools and kind of all the standard things that are involved in Oshimi's stories, but it plays out within the vampire context, and a lot of other characters get sucked in along the way. One of is the character Yukiko Gosho. Gosho is the kind of third character, the less popular girl, but the better one for the character in this story. She basically finds Makoto in the hallway struggling with his thirst for blood. They don't know each other yet. Really, like, you can start to see Oshimi getting playful with his layouts and with his stylizations in this series. Really like this sequence where he's trying so hard not to suck her blood, and just the distortions in the art, the distortions in the panel borders, the expression on his face, the strange kind of sexually charged, pin her to the floor kind of moment here. Even in this layout, like where the big eye seen from one perspective is kind of collaged next to this to make his entire face look big and distorted. There's a lot of really masterful stuff. I think Oshimi's definitely a master of his art at this point. The other kind of main characters that get involved in this are Nao Shirashi and her boyfriend Yuki. She's hiding back here. Makoto definitely has a crush on Nao, but she's dating Yuki. Yuki bullies him and picks on Makoto, but in this scene, Nao has gone to Makoto and said, "Hey, these guys are beating Yuki up. I saw in an incident earlier in the book that you're strong and willing to fight. Can you come do that?" And so here you see Makoto for the first time using his powers as a vampire. He's flying over and beats these bullies up, and that sets up a lot of the story in the first part, is the interaction between these characters. You'll see that Oshimi also, this is something he starts to do more in this book, and even more so in later books. He'll switch styles a lot, or at least switch drawing implements a lot, and that will change the style. Like when the book starts out, it seems like a pretty straightforward manga style throughout most of it. But when you get to this portion, then you start to get this really intense, heavy cross-hatching that he uses to great effect in a lot of works. And there's some even more interesting stylistic things that happen. But this sets a relationship between basically all four of the characters. You have Makoto, Gosho, Nao, and Yuki as like the core group that are dealing with this vampire, and that one of their friends is already a vampire. By the way, this series first came out in 2015 in Japan, so you can see this is like a follow-up book. In volume 2, it's just a lot of twists and turns, lots of dealings with those characters, but we get introduced to a second vampire character who comes in and is basically trying to train Makoto as a vampire or challenge him in some way, and then eventually tries to kill him. But you get a lot of these really interesting effects when they're out and flying around. A lot of these really great close-ups for emotion, but images like this where you pull back and it almost feels like a Taiyo Matsumoto or something from Akira, and you got these nice sparkly skies. So he's really developing a look for the book in this volume, and what it looks like when they're seeing the world through vampires' eyes. This is, we'll look at more examples, but this is kind of a tame version of it. He goes into almost like a Van Gogh Starry Night effect, but some really beautiful, moody imagery throughout this. In volume 3, by now, some of the other characters, including Yuki, have been turned into vampires. Here's a really awesome scene where you can see Oshimi starting to play more with abstraction and distortion in his art. This is Yuki being super, super thirsty. Just love this kind of imagery here. Like I said, to me, Oshimi's actually a more unsettling horror artist than Junji Ito, because there's so much like psychological impact in his stories. I mean, not that Junji Ito doesn't have that, but something about the way SHUZO Oshimi does this stuff, especially the distortions like this, really, really unsettle me. And then this is just a really good example of Makoto out looking for Nora in the snow, but you get that sense of the Starry Night Van Gogh effect that is always put into the night sky when the vampires are out. That's kind of like how they see the world. Here Makoto is meeting up with Nora, and they're kind of coming back into forming what their relationship is going to be for a while, where there is some kind of tenderness between them, even though she's the one that turned him and thus like was the abuser in this situation. But they do become part of like almost a team or something. In volume 5, you're introduced to a major player in the story. We're 5 volumes in, and the story takes a real turn. This is another thing I like about OSHIMI'S, is you think that there's the bald-headed kid vampire and Nora, and everyone's in the friend groups turning into vampire or wants to be turned into a vampire. That has enough narrative weight on its own that the series could keep going. But we're introduced now to like a crux point character that changes the course of the story. This character's name is Sakurane. Sakurane is a serial killer who is killing kids, and it becomes obvious throughout the course of the story that he wants to be a vampire. Like, he'll suck people's blood with a straw, and now he's starting to find some real vampires. So in this case, he's got Gosho, he's cut her neck open, and he's tempting Yuki into drinking it, and he's just trying to learn more about vampires and leverage the vampires. You get these really awesome scenes here where this is like what the world looks like to the vampires when they're thirsty. So the intensity gets ramped up as this Sakurane character gets introduced. Also, in this one, Makoto has now been stolen by a police or government agency that's looking at the vampires and investigating them and exploring them for scientific purposes. So he is now trapped in this facility, tied down. As someone who hates having my blood drawn, I don't mind getting shots, but I hate having my blood drawn. Just this, such a simple graphic here, but having the skin pulled up, I find it so absolutely disgusting. They're giving Makoto a drug, and you could see again Oshimi just really cutting loose with abstraction and distortion in a way that makes these scenes so absolutely unsettling to me. I feel like this really goes out of the bounds of what I'm used to seeing in manga art. It almost feels more like Dave McKean or something like that, real Francis Bacon in the way there's the distortions there. So in some sense, like some Lorenzo Mattotti almost or something, but just these absolutely banana pants drawings. Here is the little winky squirting in there is shown, so there's a sexual component to it. But just awesome imagery throughout. Then you get the standard time jump, the standard Oshimi time jump, where we've now jumped, I don't know how long in the future, but quite a bit into the future, where Gosho has grown up. She has this big scar on her neck that she's pretty sensitive about, usually wears this scarf to hide it. Now out in the workforce, all of that was happening while they were in middle school or high school. She's now out in the workforce wearing her scarf, and some friends pull it off and kind of bring up the old trauma of her having this serial killer having attacked her and cut her neck open to try and get a friend of hers who was a vampire to drink her blood. So that sets up basically the, shouldn't say second half, but last third of the story or something like that. All happens in this time jump and really becomes about something else. And this is what Oshimi does so well. It becomes formulaic in his work, so you come to expect it. But the setup of the first part of the book, like I said, could be its own story and has enough momentum on its own to keep going. But he'll do these time jumps and just absolutely reroute what the story is about. And almost often is showing people who went through traumatic events, now older, dealing with them in a new context. And in Happiness, that new context is still pretty intense and abusive. So jumping now from volume 5 to volume 8, there's a lot of going on, but basically Gosho has seen the Sakurani character has been released from prison and has started a cult, and goes there and finds that he's got Yuki trapped as the vampire that they're all worshiping and they're feeding, and they'll have members of the cult go in and feed him. She gets trapped and is basically trapped and abused for at least all of volume 7. He cuts off her nipples and does all kinds of awful stuff to her. Here she's finally fighting back. Yuki finally wakes up and becomes part of the situation. She has a boyfriend SHUZO at that point. I think that's his name. I think that's SHUZO, where he comes in and is trying to save her at this point. So there's a lot that's gone on. They're trying to escape, and then you basically get Yuki coming in and killing Sakurane. Here's a really great image of the painting that they have in their main hall, their like hall of worship, where Sakurane gives his like sermons basically to his cult. This really great painting of this character drinking the blood with a straw, and then you get some backstory on Sakurane that he was a serial killer already. You get to see him, as a problematic kid who tortures animals and stuff, all rendered in pencil. So you start to see Oshimi play with material and style throughout his books. That's something that really kicks in this book. There's large sections where in this, you don't really get it in this volume, but there's large sections of the cult that are drawn in like a thick brush style. They look almost like old EC comics, but here you're getting this backstory on Sakurane, where he's already a serial killer, but he encounters a vampire and becomes obsessed with them. And then you can see that like image of him, the character drinking the straw, is based on his own kind of sick predilections, whereas a serial killer, he's sexually teasing himself there, and he's using the straw to try and be a vampire himself. So really intense imagery. It takes the vampire thing, and even though there are real vampires in this, it also nails it down to the real world, something that could happen to you, a sick, perverse serial killer going out trying to drink your blood with the straw, making a cult where he's doing this. And I think grounding that grounding the supernatural horror in a real world horror really makes this work more ick to me. And that's just another one of those things that I think makes Shuzo Oshimi such a good author, and especially a horror author. He does absolutely horrifying things with his books. In volume 9, we get back to Makoto. Makoto's basically been asleep in this military facility for this whole time while this whole other story is playing out. We also find out that Nora has been in that facility as just her brain, while Yuki and all of the other Gosho, all the other characters are suffering the abuse of Sakurane. They're finally waking up, and there's some telepathy happening between Nora's brain in a jar at this facility and Makoto, who's strapped down and being tortured, experimented on. And then there's this other character here who's basically regrowing himself from his own head. These vampires, if there's any part of them left, they'll regenerate. And so you have this like absolutely terrifying, here they've got all these vampire parts in these jars, different parts of them, but you have this absolutely terrifying design of this like kind of child figure with the fucked up legs and missing an arm with his little fingers growing out. Absolutely grotesque design there, but they all escape. They've got Nora's brain, and by the end of the volume they're kind of feeling the call to come out and save their friends. And so eventually Makoto comes over and saves everybody from Sakurane and from the cult. Then volume 10 is a lot of just like epilogue, and this is where the characters get their happy ending. They get some conclusion, they get to deal with their trauma, and you'll see that the art style switches to a much more beautiful style than you get at the beginning, where all of everything's real scratchy and intense with these thick bloody marks. You start to get this lean into these very thin marks, more spread apart. You get the Van Gogh type of thing again. Some really beautiful, just calm, soothing images of the sky. This shows like how diverse of an artist Shuzo Oshimi is, and everything's always cued perfectly to the mood that he wants. These really sparse, thin, light images here. Even though they have a lot of cross-hatching on them, they feel thin and sparse. You see Nora now developing, they've saved her from this brain. And so even though there's these redemptive arcs, it's still gross, you know, where this character's starting to form a mouth and they're like dumping blood into it, but it looks quite labial, vaginal in form. So still some disturbing images as the vampires find, you know, their peace and happiness in the world. And then a really nice final image here. I won't go into all the details of everyone's ending to their story, just kind of wanting to give a look at the artwork and the end of the story, the kind of beautiful stylistic switches, jumps between things. So really satisfying conclusion to this one. It's at this point any one of them could be in the top. I think it's probably just the order that you read these things in. This one's very, very satisfying in all of the twists and turns that the story takes. I think by the time I read this one, I was a little familiar with like his patterns, Oshimi's patterns. So I would imagine if Happiness was the first Oshimi book you read, this is probably your favorite one. But also, I just think the themes of abuse that most interest me are a little more under the surface in this one because of the more bombastic storytelling. And so for me, that's the thing that bumps this down below some of the other works, even though, you know, I think it's equally well done, equally well written. It's just, in my opinion, there's 3 other of his works that I find to be more on point with what he's trying to work out, I guess, and more grounded in reality in some sense. So in that sense, scarier to me.
Make sure to like, smash that subscribe button, and ring that bell.